Hello and good morning, everyone. In today's episode, I would like to take you all the way to London, Ontario. Decades ago, this small city once held the title of serial killer capital of the world. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, London, Ontario was home to as many as 6 individual serial killers. In that time, 29 people were murdered, of which less than 20 cases are solved. And later, an update to a decades-old cold case. This is the dark history of London, Ontario. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today include an article by Jared Linzen of The Guardian, a Yahoo News article by Matthew Kautz, a Medium article by J.E. Mercedes, CBS News, and the rest I will list down below. Oh, and Wikipedia. Heavily today. Whoops. London, Ontario. Named after the English city along with a matching River Thames. The birthplace of both Ryan Gosling, my favorite actor, and Justin Bieber, my favorite pet monkey advocate, nicknamed the Forest City because of the forests, and lastly, once the murder capital of the world. Today, London is a welcoming and relatively small city enveloped in nature, as many Canadian cities are. However, between 1959 and 1984, London was rocked by 29 horrific murders. Christian Magee, a man whose most recent interviews frighten me, is one of such killers. Born in 1948 in Strathroy, Ontario, just outside London, Christian experienced a childhood many future killers tend to experience, or say they have. Quote, he was born into an abusive, loveless home that was followed by an equally loveless marriage, although the union produced 3 children, and he lacked self-esteem. When he was young, he walked around with his head down so much that his mother got him to curl his arms through a broom behind his back to force his head up. His parents berated him constantly, telling him he would never amount to anything, and an older brother who should have protected him frequently beat him up, he said. He was in his mid-teens when his father took him out of school and sent him to work full-time to help support the family. Even after he got married, he was still searching for the affection he wasn't getting from his wife. Christian told psychiatrists that at one time he was confused by sex and love, believing that forcing sex on someone could get him the affection he so desperately needed. End quote. A twisted view by any means. And Christian would succumb to his, quote, urges in 1974. According to Murderpedia, he grabbed 19-year-old Judith Barksey as she walked to her Strathroy home in March of 1974 and slashed her throat as she struggled, sexually assaulting her as she bled to death. The next year, he murdered Louise Patricia Jenner, who was also 19, strangling her with a shoelace before stabbing her in the throat with a knife as she fought with him in the kitchen of her own home in Mount Bridges in October the following year. Finally, in June of 1976, teenager Jeffrey Scholes had told his 15-year-old sister, Susan Lynn, to wait until he finished work so that he could drive her back to their parents' cottage near Strathroy. But she went on ahead anyway, accepting a ride from Christian, a familiar sight around town as he drove a truck in his job, picking up animal carcasses from farms. Like, of course that's what he did, just driving dead animals around. Christian then raped her, stabbed her in the throat, in the back, and strangled her with her halter top before dumping her body in the basement of a deserted farmhouse. Christian would end up in custody during June of 1976, and long story short, was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a high-security mental health facility where he remains today. The next Nimrod to be identified was Russell Maurice Johnson, aka the Balcony Killer or the Bedroom Killer. Wikipedia reports in 4 years, Russell Johnson, a weightlifter who worked for the Ford Motor Company of Canada, raped and strangled at least 7 women in their apartments in London and a neighboring area named Guelph. Guelph? Guelph. Guelph. He would stalk his victims to their apartments, waiting until they thought they were asleep, gaining access to their rooms by scaling the outside walls, sometimes multiple stories. There, he would sometimes watch the women sleep before attacking and sexually assaulting them and suffocating them. On New Year's Eve of 1974, 23-year-old Diane Bates, who had been engaged the night previous, was strangled in her apartment with her own bra, raped, and left to be discovered by her new fiancé. 3 years later, in April of 1977, Russell climbed 4 stories and barged into the apartment of 23-year-old Luella Jean George, raping and killing her on the spot. He would then go on to murder 49-year-old Doris Brown and 22-year-old Donna Veldboom, who lived only one apartment above his, and non-fatally attacked and assaulted 11 other women in the same area before his arrest. This came in July of 1977 when authorities arrested Russell for the murders of 3 women, Bates, Veldboom, and George. Throughout the court rulings, it was determined that Russell was unable to comprehend the cruelty of his crimes and was found not guilty again by reason of insanity and indefinitely confined to a mental care facility. Also active in London, Ontario during this time was Gerald Thomas Archer, also known as the London Chambermaid Slayer. According to Wikipedia, Gerald Archer was born in London, Ontario in 1932, and by 18 years old had a criminal record for robbery, breaking and entering, and possession. He soon began mailing letters to a woman named Mary in 1966, and they would meet in person in December of 1967. Only 11 days after their first meeting, they got married and moved in together in a town called Chatham, just outside of London again. In 1969, 62-year-old Jane Woolley, who worked as a chambermaid at a hotel called the London House, was found stabbed to death on February 3rd in her apartment on York Street in London. Investigators determined she had died days previous on January 31st. On September 4th of 1970, 57-year-old Edith Authier, who worked as a chambermaid for the William Pitt Hotel, was found stabbed to death in her apartment in Merlin. Investigators noted that this time the victim had been sexually assaulted. The following year, 57-year-old chambermaid Belva Russell, quote, was beaten to death in her Chatham apartment on January 23, 1971. Her body was discovered minutes after her death, by her husband, Reginald Tomlinson, who bumped into an unfamiliar man running out of the building as he was entering it around 2 a.m. Most of Mrs. Russell's clothing had been removed, which led investigators to assume that she had been killed during a struggle with an assailant who had attempted to rape her, end quote. The following month, Gerald Archer was picked up by authorities, and he gave them enough something to let them hold him in custody for Belva's murder until her husband identified him in a police lineup as the man who was fleeing the scene. His court appearance ended as such. Quote, when the 12-man jury finished deliberating and returned with a verdict of guilty, Archer responded to his sentence of life imprisonment by shouting, quote, that's only the first strike against me. The ball game isn't over yet, end quote. And it really wasn't. According to Wikipedia, Archer was paroled in 1985, became a drifter, and then died of a heart attack in 1995. And then it was over. After his death, his estranged wife and daughter both came forward and informed the police that Archer had once drunkenly confessed to them that he had killed Edith Authier. Afterwards, authorities exhumed Archer's remains in February 2000 to procure better DNA samples, which matched DNA extracted from cigarette butts found near Jane Woolley's body. So they got that one too. 3 serial killers, minimum, active in one area in the span of just a few years. But remember, 16 other murders in that same time frame remain unsolved. And here are just a couple of those names. Susan Cadu, Lynn Harper, Georgia Jackson, Jacqueline Dunleavy, Frankie Jensen, Scott Leishman, Helga Beer, Linda White, Patricia Bovin, Jackie English, Soraya O'Connell, Priscilla Murley, Donna Jean Alcock, and more. From in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was endless. The Guardian reports, quote, based on similarities between crime scenes and with the help of resources and technologies that were not available to the original investigators, Arntfield, who is an author of Murder City and a former Canadian detective, concluded that there were at least one and as many as four serial killers operating in London at the time with similar MOs who were responsible for the unsolved murders. But even if all of the remaining cases, all of those 16 unsolved murders, were found to be the work of a single killer, London would still retain the record for having the largest verified concentration of serial killers operating in one place at one time. Quote, New York and LA at any given time have had 4 or 5, but London at the time had a mean population of 170,000, said Arntfield, adding that in megacities like New York and LA, the per capita equivalent would be about 80 or 90 serial killers per city, end quote. Imagine that. I would never go outside. Nearly 100 active serial killers? No. But why London? Why, of all places in North America, did London, Ontario become this hotbed of criminal activity? One theory is Highway 401. This road, quote, runs along the southern border of the province of Ontario and predates the construction of the American interstate highway system by 4 years. Studies have since shown that from 56 onward, the U.S. interstate changed the criminal landscape significantly, said Arntfield, adding that the FBI has since developed a highway serial killings initiative to investigate the connection between major highways and serial murders, end quote. On top of that, London is technically an urban area, but relatively remote and surrounded by forested landscapes, providing killers with plenty of victim opportunities while staying out of populated places. Plus, at the time, London police and the surrounding neighborhood police forces didn't share information quickly and smoothly like we do today, forcing independent work rather than a collaborative approach. The true reason 29 people were murdered in 25 years will most likely remain a mystery forever. However, we can hope and work towards solving those remaining cases, giving closure to those still living and carrying on their memories. And that, my friends, is the evil history of London, Ontario. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. A bit different than usual. Golly, 90 serial killers in one city? If only. But, as always, if you'd like a bit more true crime, I invite you to stick around after the music. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Hey-oh, another cold case solved, everyone. This one is exciting. Titled, Chilling Details Emerge After Schoolmate Arrested in Hawaii Girl's 1977 Murder, of CBS News. Quote, former Hawaii lawmaker Suzanne Chun Oakland remembers arriving at school one morning in 1977 to an eerie buzz. The 15-year-old had met up with girlfriends as usual before class at Honolulu's McKinley High School when she learned a student named Dawn Momohara had been found dead on the second floor of a school building. I don't know how we got word of it, but everything spread really quickly, Chun Oakland said. She didn't know Momohara, who was 16, but the unsolved death has haunted her and other McKinley students and staff for nearly half a century. That was until last week when police used advances in DNA technology to arrest a 66-year-old resident of a Utah nursing home. The suspect, former McKinley student Gideon Castro, was scheduled to make an initial court appearance Friday before a judge in Salt Lake County District Court. He remained in custody Thursday with the bond for his release set at $250,000. Gideon's attorney, Marlene Mourn, did not respond to email and phone messages seeking comment. Momohara had been sexually assaulted and strangled, police said. On March 21, 1977, shortly after 7:30 a.m., Honolulu police found Momohara dead. She was partially clothed and lying on her back with an orange cloth tied around her neck, said Lieutenant Dina Dina T. of Honolulu Police. A subsequent autopsy ruled that Momohara was strangled to death, and the medical examiner said that there were signs of sexual assault. Details from more than 4 decades ago are fuzzy for the 1967 McKinley graduate Grant Okamura, who was the school's 28-year-old band teacher in 1977, but the morning Momohara was found has remained a core memory. Momohara's sister, one of his flute players, arrived at school that day not knowing her sister had been found dead, he recalled. The sister was called to the office and later walked into the band room, devastated. Okamura said the other students were trying to console her, and at that point I couldn't have band. How do you have class? She just sat there crying, and she didn't return to school for weeks afterwards. Police released sketches of a person of interest in a possible vehicle described by witnesses as a 1974-1975 Pontiac Le Mans. A witness reported seeing the car when he and his girlfriend drove through the campus the night before Momohara died. However, police were unable to identify a suspect, and the case grew cold, although grief lingered over the campus. At the time, police retrieved an unknown man's DNA sample from the teenager's clothing. However, they could not identify a suspect. But then in 2019, cold case detectives asked a forensic biology unit to examine several items of evidence from the scene, including Momohara's underwear. They were able to develop a DNA profile in 2020, and then in 2023, police received information about potential suspects. 2 brothers who were interviewed in 1977. Several days after Momohara was killed, detectives interviewed Gideon Castro, who graduated from McKinley High in 1976. He said he met Momohara at a school dance that year and last saw her at a carnival on campus in February of 1977. Police also interviewed his brother, who had also met Momohara at the dance. And then in November of 2023, Honolulu police went to Chicago, where the brother was living, and somehow obtained DNA from one of the brother's adult children. Lab findings excluded the brother as a suspect, but a DNA sample from Castro's adult son, and later from Castro himself proved that he was responsible. He was arrested last week at the nursing home where he lived in Mill Creek, just outside of Salt Lake City, on suspicion of second-degree murder. Neither Okamura nor Chun Oakland remembered Gideon Castro. End quote. And that's not the entire article. I recommend reading about this case in greater length and better detail than the snippet I've just given you today. But it's just wonderful to see another decades-old cold case solved, that some people are not giving up. I love it. Anywho, that is all I have for you wonderful, wonderful people today. Sheesh. Thanks for sticking around, I really appreciate it. Anyways, have a wonderful rest of your day. I will see you next week. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. God, Eli. What was that?